Thanks to ThreadUp for sponsoring this video. Say you're Elizabeth Bennet touring Pemberley, and Mrs. Reynolds is there to show you the rooms and tell you all about Mr. Darcy's secret character. But exactly who is she? What is a housekeeper? And who are all these other servants you see running around Pemberley? Well, that is what we're talking about here today. Regency era servants and why Mr. Darcy is the best boss possible. If you'd like to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So first of all, who are we even talking about? Well, domestic indoor servants. This would of course be different from the guys working on the farm or other employees a gentleman might have. Rather, these are the maids and the butlers and the housekeepers of the world that we're going into here today. And really, the domestic service market was huge within England. A lot of people hired servants, and it was the second most common form of occupation in England throughout the 19th century. So servants were a standard part of Regency era life and Jane Austen's books. So for example, a lot of people think of the ultra rich as being able to afford to have servants, right? Like Mr. Darcy clearly has them at Pemberley. But if we look in Jane Austen's books, even the poor rich people have servants. So for example, in Emma, Miss Bates, who is famous for being the poor rich person in that book, has at least one maid. Even the farmer Robert Martin's family keeps at least 2 servants. Meanwhile, we also see the Dashwoods, even when they are on hard times and Sense and Sensibility, they are still keeping at least 3 servants, one of them being a man, which was a more expensive servant to keep at the time and a major mark of social status. So even though it was common for people from the middle class up to keep at least one servant, the number of servants you kept, their gender, and their roles were major ways to signal wealth and status. So for example, having male servants was more prestigious than having female servants. Their wages were higher. They were more like showpieces. It was harder to attract them because, of course, they had a lot more job options than women did during the same time period. And it's fascinating within the book the way that Jane Austen portrays the conspicuous consumption, the display of servants as a sign of wealth when Elizabeth goes to Rosings. So Mr. Collins is, of course, in awe of Lady Catherine. And it's fascinating because the book says this. When Lizzie goes to Rosings, it says, "The dinner was exceedingly handsome, and there were all the servants and all the articles of plate which Mr. Collins had promised." Here, Jane Austen is likening the display of servants to the display of wealthy plate and dinnerware. So they were definitely a form of signaling status and wealth visually to others. Now, of course, for the genteel upper class, having servants was a standard part of life, but many even of the middle class also had servants. Some had a maid called the maid of all work, whose life was terrible. You know what you do not want to do? Get sent back to the Regency and become the maid of all work. Don't do it. Her life was a stressed out mess because she had to do everything. Meanwhile, of course, in larger households where there were more servants, there was more to share the workload. But more on that later. However, if you were born into a genteel family that always had servants, but then you have to cross over like this line from someone who has servants to one who has none, like that was a major social step down. We see even Miss Bates and Emma hasn't had to do that. But Jane Austen had an acquaintance who did it in real life, and this is what her letters say about this situation. Earl and his wife live in the most private manner imaginable at Portsmouth, without keeping a servant of any kind. What a prodigious innate love of virtue she must have to marry under such circumstances. Imagine getting married to a guy who can't even afford to keep one servant. I mean, the level of love that must be there. Or a lack of intelligence, as Jane Austen probably thought. Even Fanny Price's embarrassing Portsmouth family in Mansfield Park keeps more than one servant. I mean, I don't know. Earl and his wife, They've gone to another reality, guys. A servantless reality. Will they ever be able to recover? That's the big question here. But of course, where did these servants even come from? It might not surprise you that they came from the lower classes. Now, the historian Jessica Gerard in her book Country House Life found that how wealthy your lower class family was really influenced it how far you could go in the country house. So for example, if your father was a clerk or a farmer and you had a little bit more refinement and a little bit more education, you could potentially work your way up to being a lady's maid. But if your father was just an unskilled worker or laborer, then basically maybe you could only work up to being like a mid-level housemaid. Now, this was not a hard and fast rule, but overall, the better off financially your family was sort of helped you get the better positions servant-wise overall. Before we get into the next point, here's a word from this video's sponsor. I love building my dream wardrobe of high quality pieces that will last for years to come and thereby reduce waste. But guys, quality can be expensive, and that's why I shop secondhand with this video's sponsor, ThredUp, where I can find the perfect outfit for any occasion. So, for example, because it is spring, I decided to channel my inner I'm going to a garden party hosted by my rich ex-in-laws where I need to show them I'm doing perfectly great without their son outfit. All of my outfits have strangely specific plot lines in my head. But this dress estimates for $390 and I got it for just $69.96 on ThredUp. I also love the super cute envelope detail on this Kate Spade bag I got that estimates at $212, but I got it for just $31.50. And these shoes are from Austen Heritage, and the nude pink color I think look great with everything, including my next look. This is called my magazine editor who writes rom-coms in her spare time outfit. The top is Rebecca Taylor, the skirt is by Club Monaco, and can we take a moment to appreciate the pom-poms? And the Kate Spade bag was estimated at $426, but I got it for just $54.50 on ThredUp. I love that ThredUp lets me shop my exact size, favorite colors, brands, and more. You can even filter to only clothing that is new with tags. So this dress from CC is my going on a first date with a cute guy I met at the library dress. Are any of these situations real? No, but just dream with me here, guys. But it is also my new with tags was originally $129, but I got it for only $15 on ThredUp dress. So if you're looking to build the wardrobe of your dreams, or daydreams, then definitely check out ThredUp, where you can shop hundreds of brands at a fraction of the price. Tap my link to shop my ThredUp favorites. Yes, the things I've hearted on there, you can go and see, and find something special for any occasion today. Thanks so much, sponsorship Ellie. Now back to the video. But who were not servants? This is an important question. So for example, Jane Eyre, as a governess, was not a servant. Governesses lived in this weird little in-between land. They were not working class like the servants, but they usually came from a more genteel background, but they were now employed. So they were not entirely of the world of their employers either. They were in this weird social in-between place that nobody wanted to be. To hang out freely with the servants would have lowered a governess's dignity. Meanwhile, she could only hang out with her employers so much because they were like also her employers. Other people who lived in this social void of the in-between would be ladies' companions, women who are paid to just hang out with either an older woman or a younger woman, keep them company. They usually came from a more genteel background, and they were not servants within the household. Like, for example, Mrs. Jenkinson in Rosings is not a servant, but she's also not family. Meanwhile, you also have land agents or land stewards, which is exactly what Mr. Wickham's dad is in Pride and Prejudice. Now, I'm going to have to go into this in an entirely different video, but Mr. Wickham's dad was not a servant, but was in a weird social position. And that's why we see, for example, Miss Bingley like looking down on him and being like, oh, he's the son of a steward. Okay, let us imagine we are a young woman or man in the Regency preparing to go into service. What do we do? First of all, we want to decide what type of household we would like to serve in. Between serving at a great estate like Pemberley or in the little middle-class house in a city, you know what you should pick. What any smart servant would pick in this era. Pick the great country house. Your life is going to be so much better. Basically, of course, a maid of all work in the city is so frazzled, often like sleeping in the equivalent of a cupboard, has like piles of responsibilities adding up, where at Pemberley or another great country house, they have a clearly defined role that was within their means and a schedule, and they would just like do it. And that was their job. It was immensely better. Don't be a maid of all work in the city, guys. If time travel happens, just say no to that job listing. Just don't do it. Now, it would also be great to know, what career path are you on? Are you a life cycle servant or a career servant? So life cycle servants were servants who would enter country house service for a specific period of time, say like 10 years. The idea would be that you send your 15-year-old daughter off to work at Pemberley. She's there till she's 25. She earns extra money that she can send home to you. She learns skills, learns how to be a good wife and mother by taking care of other people. And also it's all under the care and protection of the master and mistress, who were kind of seen as the head of the whole family, including the servants, right? So like your daughter's not supposed to come home pregnant from being the maid at Pemberley, right? A young woman who worked as a maid in the 19th century put it this way: when you go to service and live with another gentleman's family, you see a lot, you learn a lot, which to me is a finishing education to every working man's daughter. So these young servants they would get their finishing education, they'd learn some skills, sometimes they could save some money to then embark on the next part of their life, which would often be marriage for women, or sometimes gentlemen would just go on to other trades and skills. But basically, this was only meant to be a certain little time period of their life that served an important purpose, and then they moved on. Or you could be a career servant. Now, these were people who were like, this is it. This is my life. I'm going to be a servant forever. And so, for example, we see Mrs. Reynolds at Pemberley has been at Pemberley for 20 years, and she is now the housekeeper, which means that she had worked up the ladder. Perhaps she entered when she was young as a maid, and then she became a different type of maid, and then she like worked her way up all the way to being a housekeeper. And yeah, she's a career servant. She's going to stay at Pemberley potentially till she retires. I don't really see Mrs. Reynolds going anywhere. Now, of course, if you want to become a career servant, then it's very important to get into a big house that has a lot of servants and a large ladder you're capable of climbing up. Because if you're in a household that only has like 2 servants, you don't have far to climb. I mean, you probably are already a senior servant inherently by just existing. You need the ability for advancement and promotion. So say you want to be a career servant at a great house. How do you go about making that a reality? How do you get a job? Well, of course, there were various pathways to becoming a servant. One was sometimes country houses just hired the people around them, right? They're like, oh, you're the daughter of our old maid. We'll hire you. Though it was also common for servants to have to go into service at a smaller household for a couple of years to just learn the basic ropes of being a servant, and then they could get a personal recommendation to move up to a big house like Pemberley. Now, while there was, of course, stuff like newspaper ads you could respond to, one of the best and most important way to get jobs was to make your employers like you, and then they'll recommend you for other positions. Families really traded good servants among themselves, would recommend them to other places. So for example, if you have a maid who you're like, she would make a great lady's maid. I don't need a lady's maid. I already have one. But my cousin needs a lady's maid. Like, because she's getting married and she needs to fill out her household. You'd be like, hey, I got the servant for you. She'd make a great lady's maid. You want her? So for example, we see in Jane Austen's letter to her niece Anna, them talking about her niece needing to hire a new maid and Jane knowing a maid that might potentially fit. Your Aunt Frank's nursemaid has just given her warning, but whether she is worth your having or would take your place, I know not. She was Mrs. Webb's maid before she went to the great house. She leaves your aunt because she cannot agree with the other servants. She is in love with the man. and her head seems rather turned. He returns her affection, but she fancies everyone else is wanting him and envying her. Her previous service must have fitted her for such a place as yours, and she is very active and cleanly. I mean, on one hand, she's active and cleanly, and on the other hand, she can't get along with the rest of the servants and think everyone's in love with her guy. I don't know. What do you think? Would you hire this maid? If you were looking out for a maid, would you be like, yes, that is the one? Now, of course, some things that could help you on your job search would be 1, experience, like we've talked about, 2, a good character, which is kind of like a letter of reference, and also 3, being attractive and tall. As we were talking about before, for great families, servants were a way to show off their wealth. And if you're trying to show off some servants, you would prefer them to be attractive and tall, and not just for men, but for women too. Otherwise, if you did want to get a job in a great house, but you were particularly short, or they didn't think you were the Regency ideal of beauty, then you might end up in the kitchen or the stables or somewhere where maybe people wouldn't see you as often. No one said that the Regency era was not shallow. I've never made such claims for them. But say you get the job experience, you get the amazing character, you finally get a recommendation to Pemberley, and you're going to be there and you're going to work for Mr. Darcy, and it's going to be so great. Well, what do you need to do? Well, you need to sign a contract. So servants were contract workers, usually for terms of 1 year. Obviously, that could be renewed. Or if your master was displeased with your service after a year, they could be like, yep, it's been a great year. See you later. So that is why we see in Mansfield Park when Fanny goes back to her family in Portsmouth and they hate their servant, she expects that they're gonna let her go after a year. The book says Fanny could not help modestly presuming that her mother meant to part with her when her year was up. Of course, will her mother really part with the servant? Probably not. Her mother doesn't really know how to manage servants and thereby knows that the next maid will be just as terrible in her mind, and thereby I don't know, what's the point of parting with this maid if the next one will also be terrible? Another important of the contract would be, of course, how much you're getting paid. Wages varied from house to house, also based on your position. Upper servants like butlers and housekeepers made much more than lower servants and newer servants like simple housemaids or kitchen maids. And also it's important to note that men did make more than women, even for a similar type of job. And also, having the different types of servants that made more, such as upper servants, was another form of socially flexing on everybody if you're rich. So that is why in Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet is a little bit offended by Mr. Collins in their dinner scene. Dinner, too, in its turn, was highly admired, and he begged to know to which of his fair cousins the excellence of its cookery was owing. But here he was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her. In a softened tone, she declared herself not offended at all, but he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. Of course, Mrs. Bennet is offended for a few different reasons in the scene. One, assuming that her daughters would ever have to be in the kitchen to begin with, was a slight on their ladyhood, but also he is more or less indicated that they're not wealthy enough to keep a cook, and a cook was one of the more expensive servants to have on your payroll. So it'd be like, I don't think you can afford that level of servant. And Mrs. Bennet's like, yes, we can. Now, of course, servant wages could seem relatively low compared to other jobs the lower class could go into, like manufacturing work, but it was made up by the excellent lifestyle and benefits if you worked in a great country house. Let's talk about that. So, the lifestyle of a country house servant. One of the things they had that was a major flex for being from the lower class was access to amazing food. So, for example, Pemberley has its own farm, streams, woods, dairy, supplying the house with a constant supply of fresh food that the servants get a benefit from. Servants ate very well at country houses comparative to what they would have done back home. Like, new servants coming into dinner for the first time could literally start crying because they have never seen this much food in their lives. Like, that is how well they ate comparative to what they would be eating back home. And this was another reason you wanted to work at a great country house, is because the owners could afford to feed you like that because it's just all coming from the estate. Someone has to eat all this fresh produce. It may as well be their servants. Something else servants got was a weekly allotment of alcohol, usually like a specific kind, sometimes a few different kinds. So even their alcohol was provided for them. Of course, most people are familiar with Downton Abbey and the housing provided for servants, where there would be the 2 separate wings for male and female servants. And yeah, like, even though they would be very basic rooms comparative to the family rooms or the guest rooms, servants in great country houses had rooms, as opposed to, again, if you were a servant in London for a middle-class family, they might literally put you in a cupboard. Don't do the cupboard life. I warned you, do not get hired as a maid of all work. If you take nothing else from this video, remember that. Another major benefit was healthcare. So while it was not a legal requirement for their masters to provide healthcare, most decent masters did. So Mr. Darcy would have called the doctor for any of his sick servants and paid for it. He would have paid their hospital bills if they had gotten very sick. And yeah, overall, that was a major perk of this job. And as was retirement. So obviously, if you were one of those life cycle servants that was just going to work for a few years and then go off to get married or do something else, they didn't really have a retirement or a pension or anything from this time period of their life other than what they could save themselves. But if you were a career servant in a place like Pemberley, there was a good chance that your master, just out of the goodness of his heart, would provide for you in your old age. For example, when Mrs. Reynolds is ready to retire, Mr. Darcy will probably provide her with an annuity to give her an income for the rest of her life, and then potentially even give her a cottage to live in on his estate for the rest of her life, rent-free, and just make sure she's taken care of in that way. Of course, only decent masters did this for their servants. Not everyone was super happy about this practice. For example, in Sense and Sensibility, we see Fanny Dashwood quite upset about it. The book says, "An annuity is a very serious business. It comes over and over every year, and there is no getting rid of it. You are not aware of what you are doing. I have known a great deal of trouble of annuities, for my mother was clogged with the payment of 3 to old superannuated servants by my father's will, and it is amazing how disagreeable she found it." I find it fascinating that Fanny's dad was decent enough to provide for 3 servants that would have been these career servants that retired, but Fanny is like, and that was terrible. Terrible life decision he made. He should not have provided for our servants. Now, something else that servants at Great House had going for them was pride. Yep, there was just this prestige. Like, if you worked at Pemberley, that was impressive. And you could take pride in your job. And we actually see in the book, Mr. Gardner assuming that's the driving force behind why Mrs. Reynolds loves Darcy so much. The book says, Mr. Gardner, highly amused by the kind of family prejudice to which he attributed her excessive commendation of her master. Right, it's like you think Darcy's great just because he gives you this prestigious job, and him being prestigious makes you prestigious, and like, Now, another little side income stream a servant could have is tips. So for example, if you see my video on Lizzie going on her vacation and touring great country houses, servants all expected some tips. So for example, they would have tipped Mrs. Reynolds, which was actually a pretty decent tip during the time period. One homeowner was even like, I wish I got all the tips my housekeeper gets for showing people around my house. She's making bank. Meanwhile, if you are a footman and you're nice, tall, and attractive, as footmen generally tended to be because their hiring practices, you could gain extra tips by having odd jobs that your master's friends hire you for. So for example, say you are Mrs. Darcy and you're going to throw a ball. and you're like, I need at least 15 footmen for this ball, but we only have 3 on staff. I'm going to borrow all of my friends and family's footmen. That is basically what they would do. They would be like, hey, Jane, can I borrow your 3 footmen? And she'd be like, okay. And so then the 3 footmen come over. Now you have 6 footmen, and you just like keep collecting footmen from all these places until you have the 15 for your ball. However, my friends, you would tip all of them. So this was like a little extra side income stream footmen could have, is like going to other people's balls. Meanwhile, if you're a Lizzie with 15 footmen at your ball, not only does that look super fancy, but it also shows that you have the social network to be able to do that, right? You have enough friends who have enough footmen to make your ball immaculately servanted. I don't know if servanted is a word, but it is now. So now you have this great job, you have a contract, you have a room, you have beer allowances. Then what do? Now that you're working at Pemberley? You work your way up the ladder. So basically, Pemberley could have had 10, 20, 30 plus servants that ran it, which gave you a lot of room for upward nobility. Not only that, Mr. Darcy technically would have had 2 housekeepers. There would have been Mrs. Reynolds at Pemberley, and then there would have also been a housekeeper at the family townhouse in London. So your townhouse was usually staffed by a skeleton crew of a housekeeper and a couple of other servants to keep it safe, to keep it well maintained in your absence. And meanwhile, your housekeeper at Pemberley is doing the same thing when you're in town. A lot of people would actually transport the bulk of their servants from their country house to their townhouse. If they were really settling down in town for several months, they'd be like, okay, I'm just going to bring the majority of servants from one place to the other. And that is something we see happening in Pride and Prejudice with Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. So for example, towards the end of the book, when Mr. Bingley is coming back to town, it's fascinating because it says, the housekeeper at Netherfield had received orders to prepare for the arrival of her master, who was coming down in a day or 2 to shoot there for several weeks. So there has been the servant that's just been hanging out at Netherfield this entire time that Mr. Bingley's been gone. She's just there, chilling, making sure the house goes well, but she now has received word they need to get it all ready for him coming back, and she's finally becoming relevant to Mr. Bingley's life again. Anyway, if you are a young maid entering Mr. Darcy's service and you want to be a career servant, that is great because that has 2 opportunities for you to become like the top dog of the female servant chain. And of course, as you worked your way up, you would gain more prestige, and at some point you would go from being a lower servant to an upper servant. So some traditional upper servant jobs were things like butler, housekeeper, valet, lady's maid, cooks and chefs were also upper servants, head coachmen. Basically, they were in senior positions and they got extra perks, not just better pay. Often the housekeeper had her own parlor, and some upper servants got their own personal assistant. So basically, the assistant for Mrs. Reynolds would be someone called a still-room maid. And even though she was called a still-room maid, more or less her job description was housekeeper's assistant. However, once you get hired at Pemberley, you just start working your way up the ladder and are finally able to become Mr. Darcy's housekeeper after he retired dear Reynolds to a cottage on his estate, and you are now just able to tell everybody what to do and have your assistant the still-room maid and give tours and earn some extra tips off of tourists. Meanwhile, if you're a gentleman, you could work your way up to being the butler, or even above him, a position called a house steward. Now, house stewards were very different from land stewards, which is what Mr. Wickham's dad was. House stewards were more just the servant staff above butler. Not a lot of houses had them. It was one of those things that only a great house like Pemberley might have. Anyway, you could work your way up to being a house steward. So that, my friends, is how to be a servant in the Regency era and work for Mr. Darcy, who is the ideal boss because he has a big house with lots of servants, will pay for your retirement and healthcare, and is just generally a nice guy. Let me know in the comments down below, if you were going into service in this era, would you be trying to work at Pemberley? Let me know. And definitely check out this video sponsor. So if you're looking to build the wardrobe of your dreams or daydreams, then definitely check out ThredUp, where you can shop hundreds of brands at a fraction of the price. Tap my link to shop my ThredUp favorites and find something special for any occasion today. And as always, guys, keep being awesome, because you're awesome. Bye!